Joining us now on the debate in Montreal, Quebec, Bruce Hicks, political scientist at the University of Montreal. In the nation's capital, Tim Powers, Vice President, Communications at Summa Strategies. Bob Plamondon, author of Blue Thunder, The Truth About Conservatives from Macdonald to Harper. And Susan Riley, columnist at the Ottawa Citizen. And back here in studio, Jerry Nichols, author of Loyal to the Core, Harper, Me, and the National Citizens Coalition. I want to thank you all for coming on the program, particularly since some of you might be scratching your head. Why is this Ontario station doing a program about a backbencher from Quebec that probably most Ontarians haven't heard about? Well, you're about to find out. Be patient, everybody. Michael, let's bring this graphic up, because here's the 411, if you like, on Maxime Bernier. He's almost 48 years old, born in Saint-Georges-de-Beauce, Quebec. His father's a former Conservative MP. Gilles Bernier was in the Mulroney years. January of 2006, he's elected the Conservative MP for the Beauce. Later that year, he becomes the Minister of Industry. Big job. The next year, he gets a bigger job, Minister of Foreign Affairs. To the extent people remember him in Ontario, they may remember how it all came crashing down in May of 2008, the Couillard affair. Julie Couillard, this woman who had ties to biker gangs and so on. He had to resign from the cabinet after it was discovered he left some documents, secret documents, in her place. And then in 2008, however, he's re-elected the MP for the Beauce with the largest majority of all Conservatives in Quebec, Conservative MPs, that is. So we also want to talk about him because he's been in the news a lot lately for taking some very un-Quebec-like positions, if I can put it that way, against a federal role in healthcare, against public funding for the new arena in Quebec City. So let's start with this. Susan, to you first. Why is Maxime Bernier seen by some to be a guy worthy of attention right now?
He's a big personality. He's attractive. I don't mean to be trivial, but that doesn't hurt. He's immensely popular in his area of Quebec, in the Beauce, and he speaks with a certain clarity, as ideologues often do, and clarity is sadly missing, I would say, in the federal political dialogue.
Jerry, how would you answer?
I would agree with Susan. I think he is providing a voice for a large constituency of Canadians, particularly conservative Canadians, who believe in less government, who believe in free markets, and who believe that government should be smaller and not bigger. They're not hearing a lot of politicians talk like that. They're not hearing a lot of people in the Harper government talk like that. So to hear Maxime Bernier come up and talk like a real conservative, I think a lot of conservatives find that really refreshing.
Tim, he's a backbencher, though. He's a defrocked, former cabinet minister, backbencher from rural Quebec. Why is he giving speeches at the Albany Club? Why is he giving speeches at the Economic Club of Canada?
Well, he's also a politician, and they tend to be ambitious, Steve. I think, Maxime's a curious individual. He plays against type for your typical conservative politician from Quebec. I think he's doing a number of things. One, I think he's setting the sands, if you will, for either a return to cabinet in the future or perhaps a leadership run, whether it be here in Ottawa or in Quebec. And I think part of what he's trying to do is also build up some bona fides amongst people, conservatives, who may play a role in shaping his future. And the final point I'd add is Maxime in Ottawa is not seen as he is seen in the rest of the world. When looked upon here by many people, fairly or unfairly, he's seen as not being substantial. He's seen as being a bit of a party boy. And I think those of us here who view this current exercise see it as something different than Jerry and others may view it as a reputation-building exercise, not so much to enhance his stature as a thinker per se, but more as an exercise to rebuild from base before he even gets to that thinking portion.
Bob, could you come in on that? Because how he's seen in Ottawa and how he's seen in his hometown are no doubt two different things, right?
Well, I think what's really fascinating about Maxime Bernier is he's really a counterculture individual. Mm-hmm. These are not views that you expect to hear from someone coming from the province of Quebec in particular. I think he's certainly popular in the province of Quebec, but I think he's as or more popular in provinces like Alberta, where his ideas that he's bringing forward are really extremely well received. I disagree with Tim on the motivation for Maxime. I don't see this as a personal resurrection of a man who was defeated, not defeated, but sorry, was taken out of cabinet. I really see this as him standing up for what he believes in, representing a faction of the conservative movement in Canada. And he's been consistent on those views, I think, from his very early days in politics.
Well, here are some of those views. And Bruce, I'll get you to comment on them first. I'm going to read an excerpt from a speech he gave at the Albany Club, the big Tory posh place in downtown Toronto. This is what he said on October 13th. Ottawa exercises a lot more than the slightest control over local legislatures. The federal government today intervenes massively in provincial jurisdictions, and in particular in health and education, two areas where it has no constitutional legitimacy whatsoever. This is not what the Fathers of Confederation had intended. The objective of the 1867 Act was not to subordinate provincial governments to a central authority, but rather to have sovereign provinces within the limits of their powers dealing with local matters that directly affected citizens, and a sovereign federal government within the limits of its own powers dealing with matters of general national interest. What's your reaction to that speech, Bruce?
Well, it's actually in keeping with the Quebec government's view of Confederation as well. You know, Quebec is the only province that still subscribes to the belief that Confederation was a compact of provinces, and therefore that the provinces came together simply to pool resources for national defense, but everything else should be left to provincial jurisdiction. So he's not really saying anything that doesn't have resonance in the province of Quebec. Where he adds to that, which makes him interesting, and I'd agree with Bob that makes him very interesting for English Canada, is that he couples that with the fiscal conservatism, and that's not normally heard here in Quebec.
Well, Susan, do we give him kudos for having a discussion about something as arcane as which level of government should be doing what in this country in the dawn of the 21st century?
Yes, but I think it's got a limited appeal, even within Quebec, that argument. We do have, fortunately, we have an historian in our humble group, but as a humble scribe, I have never really associated that idea with conservatism, with mainstream conservatism. I could be wrong. We'll see how far he gets. In my sense of Maxime Bernier, in a way, is that he's a novelty act, but novelty is a good thing in this political arena that we're in now.
Well, Bob, is he more than a novelty act, though? He's saying things around the country right now that not a lot of other people, certainly no one in the political arena is saying right now.
Well, from what I hear, he is among the MPs in the Conservative caucus on Parliament Hill. He is one of the ones in greatest demand for fundraisers. Because he's a draw. He's a great speaker. He's got ideas, and people who are engaged in politics, at least at a riding level, are there because they've got passionate views, and he seems to have tapped into a lot of those views. I don't see him as a novelty act at all. I think he's going to have a profound influence, for example, on the budget that will likely come down next February. I think he's had a huge influence on the government's decision whether to fund an arena in Quebec City or not. And he's opened up a whole dialogue around the Constitution and around who should do what and respecting provincial rights, which has been, I think, for the past 30 or 40 years, been a place of some comfort in conservative ranks.
In which case, Jerry, is he making this conservative government actually more conservative?
I hope so. I mean, somebody has to be pushing this government in the right direction.
I know you hope so, but do you think he's actually having an influence?
I don't know, but what I can tell you is that he's exciting and mobilizing the conservative movement. I was in the States working on a political campaign there for the last 9 months, so I wasn't hearing a lot of the news through the mainstream media. Strangely, they don't carry a lot of Canadian news in the States.
I'm shocked.
But I was getting a lot of updates from conservatives. Maxime Bernier is giving a speech in Calgary. He's talking here. They'd send me emails. They'd send me Facebook messages, and they're really excited. Why? Because this guy is exhibiting something which is really rare in Ottawa these days, political courage. He's going out there and saying what he believes in. It might hurt his political career, it might make the Prime Minister upset, but he's getting out there, he's mobilizing the base, and I hope that results in some kind of pressure on the Tory government to start moving in a more fiscally conservative direction.
Okay, Tim.
Well, a number of points just in response to the comments that have been made. I think Maxime right now is a vehicle for aspiration, and he's smart enough to understand the political opportunity that's presented to him, as Jerry's well elucidated, that there is a strong element of the Conservative Party and conservatives in the country who do resonate to the message that he's delivering. But I do think, though, the professor, I believe it was talking about his appeal, or maybe it was Bob. Justin Trudeau's also appealing to many in the Liberal Party as well because of the star qualities in terms of physical disposition and personality as well. So let's not overvalue that. I think to understand Maxime right now, you have to understand what has happened to him since he's come into federal politics. In 2006, when he immediately came into the federal arena as the Minister of Industry, there were some around here, some of Susan's peers, some within the Conservative Party, who were already anointing him the next Prime Minister. He actually believed believed his own headlines, got himself in trouble, and as a consequence of that actually fell significantly from grace. He is really trying to reestablish himself. He is that vehicle right now. He is not the embodiment that many of you are describing him as, in my view anyway.
Okay, but
I think the Prime Minister's relationship to him is very interesting, and you know, I don't know, I don't claim to know what it is, but my sense is, at least the rumor certainly has been, Tim would know better than I, that you know, that in Mr. Harper's inner circle there isn't a lot of respect for Mr. Bernier's intellectual chops, let's say, although he does certainly hold to certain ideas very strongly. But I think I think the only reason that he's on such a long leash, especially compared to other cabinet ministers and other members of caucus, is that he is advancing ideas that Mr. Harper himself is very comfortable with personally, but may understand that politically he can't go as far as Mr. Bernier can go. If Mr. Bernier was going around the country, for example, selling a carbon tax, I think he'd be, really, it'd be like a kite hitting a live wire. I mean, we wouldn't be hearing about him at all.
But Bruce, it's also probably fair to say that given that Mr. Harper desperately needs to hang on to his Quebec seats and add to them if he hopes to get a majority next time, he doesn't want to alienate one of the few guys who's got one of the really safe Quebec seats, right?
Well, and Harper doesn't really have much control over Bernier. He's already fired him. You know, the Prime Minister has a carrot to offer, and that's cabinet, and a stick, and that's to take away cabinet and move you to the back benches. Well, he can't really move him much further, and Bernier's safe in his own riding. So I don't think Harper can control him. Harper is one who controls the message. It's a very tight ship, very few people talking. So the fact, you know, Bernier talking is going to be heard because no one else is talking at the same time.
Can I pick up on that, Steve? Because I think Bruce makes an excellent point. I think the intuitive thing, and he just spoke to it a moment ago, was, you know, Harper runs this tight ship, Jerry, and others have written well about that, and the Prime Minister has a certain modus operandi. The counterintuitive thing here is having Bernier out speaking. I don't think that hurts the Prime Minister at all. I think it appeals to a broad cross-section of Conservatives in different parts of the country. It plays to the counter-type that Harper is controlling. So having this voice, saying some of what the Prime Minister said before he became Prime Minister, isn't necessarily a bad thing, particularly as it relates to allowing for, as has always been in the case with Conservatives, a healthy discussion about how Conservatives can best run the country from their perspective.
Okay, fair enough. Let me go to Jerry on this, though, since you just got back to from the United States. Many American politicians walk around with their copies of the Constitution in their pockets, and we all remember Senator Byrd doing this on the floor all the time. You know, this is not the founders did not want this. They didn't want, you know, the residual powers go to the states, and they didn't want the federal government involved. Okay, they do that down there all the time. We don't do that here. We don't have politicians wandering around saying the federal government has no business in the, you know, in healthcare and education. This guy's saying that. Why is this flying with him?
Well, I think what he's talking about is an important part of conservative ideology. The idea is that government operates best when it's closest to the people. So therefore, central government shouldn't be as strong as provincial governments. This is a very strong point of conservative principle, and I think Maxime Bernier is getting that case out there very well, and I think it's a discussion we should be having in this country.
Okay, but Bob, if you're the conservative Canadian Prime Minister, do you really want a backbencher out there saying that the federal government has no business being involved in the health or education of the public?
Well, look, Stephen Harper is the leader of a coalition of a collection of conservative interests and factions, whether they're blue Tories, red Tories, libertarians. I mean, he's got to bring them all together in common cause to defeat the Liberals. So, and I think I agree with him that I think it helps him, that it shows that within the Conservative Party itself, there's room for these different voices. Now, if I can just pick up one point that you made, Steve, about the Constitution and not walking around Parliament Hill with our copies of it. There is a history in Canada of respecting the Constitution. If you go back, even from Quebec in particular, if you go back to the days of Maurice Duplessis, he stood for an autonomous Quebec within a united Canada. And I don't think that the views that Maxime Bernier is advancing today are really that different from what was advanced by Quebec politicians before Pierre Trudeau came on the scene.
Susan, in which case is Maxime Bernier carrying some of Stephen Harper's water? He's saying some of the things that Harper wishes he could say, but probably can't, because he's got to be more, as Bob puts it, he's got to be more careful about keeping that coalition together.
Absolutely, and he wouldn't be allowed to speak if he wasn't. I think the kind of ideas he's putting forward would be unrecognizable, unacceptable to Brian Mulroney, for example. It's got so little to do with Brian Mulroney's approach to conservatism, the way he managed the party, and I think they're going to be profoundly unwelcome to Canadians at large in Quebec and elsewhere. In theory, it might make a nice, tidy argument, and it might have historical validity. In reality, the delivery of health care is so important to people that it needs the involvement of both levels of government, and it's obviously consuming huge amounts of money as well.
Let me get Tim on that as well. Tim, do you think and I don't know if you've talked to the Prime Minister or any of his people about this or not, you can tell us, but would his people not be concerned about a prominent backbencher giving speeches all over the country, and from what I've been able to count, 23 events all over the country, public events since January of this year, saying that the federal government ought to get its nose out of healthcare and education?
You've described him as prominent. Here he's sort of described of that's Max. And I think it's that's Max label, also called Mad Max here, fairly or unfairly, because he sort of meanders here and meanders there. And personally, I appreciate that, and I like the fellow. But I think the weight you afford Maxime Bernier is very different than what the Prime Minister does. And I go back to what I said a moment ago. I don't think they get too upset to have prominent, a conservative, an elected one, offering views that were not too unlike what the Prime Minister offered years ago.
Jerry?
Well, I think what Tim said is sort of, to me anyway, encapsulates the problem with the Conservative Party. They sort of brush aside economic conservatives or fiscal conservatives. They put together what I call this red reform party, where they're fiscally liberal, big government, big spending, big deficits. And on the other hand, they're kind of populist with law and order and crime and all these kinds of stuff. But there's no place in their coalition for economic conservatives, for conservatives who want less government, lower taxes, individual freedom, free markets. There's no place for those kinds of people until now. Now there's somebody, Maxime Bernier, who is speaking for these people, and so I think it's wrong for Tim to sort of brush him aside as Mad Max. He's out there. He isn't.
Sure
He's
Tim's
representing a lot of people in this country.
But wait, can I just say his predecessor is still very alive and well on Parliament Hill. I remember when Jim Flaherty, you probably remember too, Steve, when he was considered a fiscal conservative. When he was running the shop for Mike Harris, and when he first came to Ottawa and first was made finance minister, I remember in some cases the great alarm that oh goodness, we're really going to turn right now. And I think it's not so much that they're ideologically squishy, it's that they're faced with reality. It's a complicated country. It's not a libertarian country by and large. Certainly that is an element of the population. I mean,
but Susan, Maxime's trying to influence that.
Go ahead, Bob.
He is.
I was going to say, Maxime's trying to, it's not just
Yeah,
the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister. I mean, he's getting coverage right across the country in a variety of forms, including today. People are going to stop and listen to what he has to say, and I think he has an opportunity to influence Canadian public opinion.
Well, to that actual point, let me just, and Bruce, I'll get you to comment on this first. The Globe and Mail, the national newspaper, for goodness sakes, wrote an editorial about a conservative backbencher named Maxime Bernier, who must have some profile, or the Globe wouldn't have written this about him. Members of Parliament don't need to feel like nobody's the Globe editorialized 100 feet from Parliament Hill. Maxime Bernier's call for a radical decentralization of the Canadian Federation, made in a recent speech to the Albany Club in Toronto, shows that elected officials have the ability to shape the intellectual debate in Canada if only they show the courage. The mere act of speaking, not from someone else's talking points, but from his own heart and mind, has allowed Mr. Bernier's manifesto to cut through what passes for ideological discussion in Ottawa. Politicians who aspire to be more than partisan yes men and women could learn from Mr. Bernier's example. They may have to set aside their cabinet aspirations for now, and Mr. Bernier's intervention may be evidence of his leadership ambitions, but the public benefit could be great. Those who want to make a new case for the party's reform roots, or opposition members looking for renewal in their ideological ranks, should follow Mr. Bernier's lead. Okay, what do you say about that, Bruce?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that a newspaper would want lively discussion and debate. Bernier has a great appeal because he's from Quebec. When during the Mulroney years, you had people who would speak out from Alberta and espouse very right-of-center policies that government should take, and they were dismissed as dinosaurs. The fact he comes from a province that is known for its social programs, that has a long history of social democratic parties being in power here, and those policies becoming government policy, I think that's what makes this so unique. That, plus, I agree with Susan, the fact that he has a certain sex appeal. You know, he had a biker chick girlfriend and so on. You know, he's got a star quality. Whether or not there's substance there, he speaks for a percentage of the population. It's not the majority of the population, but it is that percentage of the population where the Reform Party came from, where the Canadian Alliance came from, and why they fought for so long to steal the name Conservative, because they want to move politics to the right.
Go ahead,
But
Susan.
and I also we shouldn't overestimate his popularity in Quebec either. I mean, he's golden in the Beauce, which is a part of Quebec with its own personality, close to the U.S. border. It's always been very entrepreneurial and small business oriented. But in other parts of the province, I mean, he is making extremely insulting remarks about Quebecers, calling them the spoiled children of Confederation and attacking the so-called statist model. He's not the first one. Jean Charest used to do this in the olden days before he faced the realities and limitations of power. These are not popular arguments, but still, they're fair. It's fair to put forward arguments. But I'm picking up an almost insulting tone. And as we know, Quebecers are very sensitive to insult. It reminds me of Jean Chrétien. You know, at the end of Jean Chrétien's time in power, he was way more popular in Alberta even, or in parts of the, not necessarily among voters, but I mean, he was more popular outside of Quebec than he was within.
Jerry?
Well, there's always an argument from those on the left that Conservatives can never get elected. And the fact is, Conservatives can never get elected until they are elected. You know, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Mike Harris, none of these people could get elected. And my goodness, progressive, socialist, left-wing Toronto just elected Rob Ford as mayor. So Conservatives can get elected. And I would argue that perhaps what's happening in Quebec is that Maxime is picking up on a sense there that they're tired of big government. They're tired of all the wasteful government spending. They're tired of big union bosses calling the shots. And they want to change. And I think that attitude is something that can appeal to Canadians right across the country, not just libertarians, not just Conservatives, but to Canadians who are fed up with big government.
It's funny you put it that way, because most of the discussion you hear around the country these days is Liberals can't get elected anymore. That's what they say.
Steve,
Go ahead, Tim.
You know, and it's terrible that Liberals can't get elected. I lose sleep about that every night. But I want to go back to something Jerry said. I'm not trying to dismiss Max, Jerry. I'm just trying to describe a typology that is guilty of being perpetrated upon him here. I think the challenge, though, that we all have in the Conservative Party and those who advocate conservative views is to build him up too quickly as well. And I think that's a danger he faces. I think if we put all of our expectations for a libertarian perspective and more or less government in Maxime, he's bound to fail because he will never live up to that. We create these utopian figures in the conservative movement and they don't succeed. And I think that's the danger that Bernier is having here. And I go back to his core motivations. Let's understand where he fell and why he fell and look at what he's doing now. I fully support having an open and healthy dialogue in the party and fully support the whole notion of lesser government, but let's ground it in the circumstances in which it's happening.
Well, Tim, let me follow up with you on this, because obviously the concern about him earlier was that if he shows up for his swearing in with a biker chick in a very scantily clad dress, and you know, that somehow that offends Ottawa's sensibilities about the way you're supposed to do things. Do you think he's learned from that and has changed his ways?
Well, I didn't tell you, it wasn't a bad day for me watching TV. My sensibilities weren't offended that day. It's less him offending Ottawa's sensibilities, Steve, and more of him not sort of buying his own press clippings. I'll go back to that point. He's made some efforts to integrate and understand some of his fellow colleagues here, because to succeed as a Conservative, as we all know, to succeed in any political movement, you need your team. I think he sort of went about it in a clumsy way and is working to try and repair that, particularly in the West, where he may have rubbed some of his caucus mates, as opposed to the Conservatives in the field, a little bit of the wrong way.
Bob, let me try
Tim,
this with you.
let's not
Yeah,
characterize him just by, you know, the security breach and maybe his colorful romantic life. He has a record as industry minister and as minister for foreign affairs. And when he was industry minister, he broke through quite a few files, particularly in telecommunications, to open them up to free enterprise. He was presented with options to protect local Quebec industries, particularly one that was dominant in his own riding, who were manufacturers of bicycles, and he said, no, I'm a supporter of free enterprise, whether it's in my riding or in my province or across the country. And so, you know, he does have a record as a cabinet minister that I think is worth examining.
Susan, is there any question in your mind that much of this is designed to increase his profile for an eventual run for the Conservative leadership someday?
I think he's idea-driven, but I also think he definitely has his profile in mind. I mean, he wants to use his profile, his skills, and his contacts to advance his ideas. But I agree with whomever it was in the panel earlier who said that this is not purely personal ambition at work.
And Bob, you wrote the book on all the Tory leaders from MacDonald to Harper, so I should ask you, as you consider all of the people who've led the Conservative Party over the years, how does he either fit or not fit in with that profile?
Well, I can't really say that he fits in with any of them in particular. Certainly none of them have been, ideologues or very far to the right on fiscal issues. And on the Constitution, I think he resembles more some provincial politicians. But the fellow who I think he most resembles in terms of style and approach and being provocative, although he's the antithesis of him in terms of the philosophy that he adapts, but it's Pierre Trudeau.
That's what I thought you were going to say. Yep. How about
Pierre Trudeau was very critical of his fellow Quebecers for not asserting themselves and taking their rightful place in Canada, and he put ideas forward without appearing at the time anyway to be vying for the leadership bid. He thought this was a great big joke that he would be considered a potential leader, but Maxime has a bit of that, and certainly the charisma.
Let's focus on the Quebec angle here, and Susan referenced this a few minutes ago about one of the speeches he gave in Quebec to Quebecers, chastising the heck out of them. And here's that speech, or an excerpt of it anyway. "Let's be frank," he said, "many people in the rest of the country perceive Quebecers as a bunch of spoiled children who are never satisfied and always ask for more. The perception has some basis in reality. It derives from 40 years of futile debates over independence, 40 years of irresponsible policies adopted by one provincial government after the other, living beyond their means and getting us deeper into debt, 40 years of demands to extract yet more money from the pockets of our fellow citizens in the rest of Canada. We have to get out of this false choice between independence and profitable federalism. We also need to put an end to policies that lead to our impoverishment and to stop expecting the rest of Canada to bail us out with more equalization money." That's pretty, Bruce, I'll go to you. You're in Quebec. That's pretty tough stuff. What's been the reaction in Quebec to that kind of a speech?
Well, and he's not alone in making these critical comments. I would recommend that Maclean's not put Quebec as a spoiled child on its cover. But there are people in Quebec who criticize, the size of government, the way the government operates. The challenge in this province, though, is that provincial politics is very much politics of independence. So you either are voting for the Parti Québécois or you're voting for the Liberals. So if anything that is right of centre, since the Parti Québécois is the Social Democratic Party, has to come from the Liberals. Now, the ADQ tried to capitalize on dissatisfaction, but once again, it got absorbed by the independence, and it's an either-or question, and it is for most Quebecers, and that dominates politics. So in other provinces, you'll have the to and from between the left and the right on economic issues. It tends to get buried here because of the nationalistic tone to politics, and the way politicians here play to that in order to stay in power. So I don't know, maybe now that there's a huge economic downturn, things might change here in Quebec, but I don't know that it'll take traction. It's noteworthy that the ADQ had failed, and now they're turning to this sort of Tea Party approach with this Liberty Quebec, which is going to try and push an agenda as a movement. I don't know 400 people a movement makes, but time will tell. We are in a recession, and it's times like that where people turn to more radical ideas.
Well, Tim, you can imagine people in English Canada, wanting to go up and give this guy a pat on the back for saying something like that to Quebec in Quebec. But you can also imagine that some Quebecers might find that pretty offensive. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think you're right, but I do think there is a bit of a shift. I don't know how monumental in Quebec. Bruce would know better than I. That's reflective in the rest of Canada. We always say Quebec and then the rest of Canada and then segment it even further. But I think it's kind of what happened in Toronto yesterday, and I don't want to over metaphorize what happened there, but I think you did see voters connect with a politician who understood their immediate needs, their immediate purposes, things they could touch, feel, and see. And I think Bernier cottons on to that. He understands that people all have a broader vision of the province, but the immediacy of government in their lives, because their disconnect is such now that it's not as consistent as it was in the past, is what can the government do for me? So what he's talking about, an orthodoxy of limited government with wise choices based on the economy, probably resonates with more people in Quebec than it once did, and I think that's true across the country.
Bob, what about that? Are there enough people in Quebec who would find this message appealing?
I think it's going to be a tough message because for a generation, Quebec has operated on the basis of profitable federalism, and and they've used it to great advantage. So I think we're probably a couple of elections before this starts to really take hold in the province of Quebec. But I think it certainly will resonate outside the province of Quebec.
And Jerry,
Can I just wave a little flag for the Quebec model, please, which is being dumped on from all sides? I mean, I live in Quebec too and have for many, many years. Right on the border, it's a whole different world from Montreal to Quebec City, I grant you. I think the Quebec model has got a lot going for it. I love Hydro-Quebec. We get excellent delivery. We get reasonable rates.
Now we are going to have a fight here. You love Hydro-Quebec. You know where I'm from. My gosh. Terrible.
Oh yeah, well, there's
the
that.
Newfoundlander among us here is not
Indeed,
crazy
yeah.
about Hydro-Quebec. But
You don't
anyway.
want to get our
plug here,
Newfoundlander mad at you, that's for sure. Just by way of saying, the healthcare system is badly fractured. It's floundering. As a client of that system, as everybody in Quebec is, I don't know if the first thing you think of is, oh, let's forego federal funding, or let's get the feds out of healthcare. I mean, probably it's not just more money that's going to fix it, but I just don't think this is a very marketable philosophy, however attractive it might be theoretically.
Well, Jerry, picking up on that, the fact is I think most people see Quebec as the most social democratic, or certainly open to that part of the political spectrum, province in the entire country. This guy is kind of spitting in the face of that whole history. Has he got the wrong message?
Well, I think he's the little boy saying the emperor's naked. He's the only one, I think, that could give that speech. I don't think an Anglo federal politician could go into Quebec and say those things. He can say them, and he can get away with them because he has some standing in that province, and his message is right. I mean, the Quebec model deserves to be dumped on because it isn't working, and I think it's imposing a huge cost burden on the people of Quebec.
Bruce, I'm going to get you to speak to this. The Quebec Freedom Network is the English name of it. It's I guess, new right of center movement that's just launched in the province the past weekend. Maxime Bernier, I think, showed up and spoke at the convention or at the conference this past weekend. Yes, it's small. Yes, it's nascent. Yes, we have no idea what it could turn into. But there was a poll taken the other day that showed if they were an actual party running candidates in the next provincial election, they'd win. And they don't really exist yet. What are you reading into all of that?
Well, I think you need caution looking at that poll, because basically the question that they're asking people is, do you like Charest, do you like the PQ, or do you like none of the above? And most people will go none of the above most of the time until they actually have to go into a polling station, and none of the above isn't on the questionnaire. So this imaginary party that doesn't exist, that will be fiscally conservative, that might have a good leader, would you like them or the Charest government, which is incredibly unpopular, or the PQ, which they're not ready right now for, it's not surprising those numbers came in. I don't think that's reflective of a shift in attitudes and values amongst Quebec voters. The ADQ tried to capitalize on that. It was a political party. It fielded candidates, and it was only a rump of a party at the best of times. And then it dwindled entirely once the PQ came back in strength. They're now turned to a movement. This is what's happened in the United States with the right of center in the Republican Party, is the Tea Party has been trying to capitalize on the weakness in the Republicans to hijack many of their candidates. Next week, we'll probably see a number of them elected to Congress. It's easier to do in the U.S. because there are only two political parties. Our system allows for parties to emerge, and therefore voters can splinter off in a much easier fashion in Canada. So you have, a multi-party system here. I don't know. Like I said earlier, we are in a recession. That's the time when more radical parties and movements emerge, and they get some traction with people because people are frustrated and people are hurting, and people vote with their pocketbook.
Let me jump in, Bruce, because we're down to less than 2 minutes to go here, and I want to get everybody on this. How far can Maxime Bernier go? Tim?
Well, I think he can go pretty far. I think, though, he has to, at some point, decide where it is he wants to go. Does he want back into cabinet, or does he want to be a leader of the party, because that will determine how he continues to position himself, or does he want to step out of this arena and go back provincially and do something else? So I think he has to determine what his objective is. I don't think he knows that for sure, and based on what that objective is, he can go fairly far, I think.
Bob, what do you say?
I think he has the potential to start an important national dialogue. to make politics relevant again, because I think the differences that we see today on Parliament Hill between the parties are very minor. What he's talking about is major.
Susan, could we be talking about Stephen Harper's successor here today?
I didn't believe that Stephen Harper would ever become Prime Minister, so don't ask me. I don't think so. You know, it would be interesting if other cabinet ministers or other people with ideas, even within the Conservative Party, were given more leeway. It would be interesting if a real discussion started, but I still don't think it's necessarily his ideas are falling on fertile ground.
Got it. Jerry, last 10 seconds to you.
Well, 10 seconds. I think he can be the leader of the Conservative Party one day. As an ideologue, I like him for his ideas. To put on my political consultant hat, I think the fact that he has a strong base in Quebec and has ideas which are popular in Western Canada would make him an ideal candidate.
Terrific. Thanks, everybody, for a great discussion today about the curious case of Maxime Bernier, starting in Ottawa with Susan Riley, the columnist of the Ottawa Citizen, Tim Powers from Summa Strategies, Bob Plamondon, Blue Thunder, that's the name of the book. The truth about the Conservatives from MacDonald to Harper, and there's Bruce Hicks as well, the political scientist at the University of Montreal, and Jerry Nichols, loyal to the core, Harper, me, and the National Citizens Coalition. Got all the plugs in, everybody. Thanks a lot.